This episode of the podcast is brought to you by New Bloom Labs.
Are you a cannabis operator that's frustrated with your third-party testing lab? If so, don't worry, you're not alone. Whether it's the long wait for your certificates of analysis, inconsistent reports, or reports that are just hard to understand in general, it seems as though some analytic labs do more to frustrate their customers than actually serve them. But it doesn't have to be that way. Instead, call New Bloom Labs. New Bloom understands the cannabis industry and what's important to growers, processors, and manufacturers. New Bloom Labs offers the fastest turnaround time in the industry, delivering most test results in just one business day. So stop waiting for your testing result, and instead, for superior science and rapid results, call New Bloom Labs at 844-TEST-CBD or visit their website at newbloomlabs.com. Superior science, rapid results, New Bloom Labs. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast, your favorite podcast that includes industry-facing conversations with the industry's leading experts that aim to educate and inform the public regarding the plant's endless benefits. My guest today is Sturges Karban. He's the CEO at ManifestSeven. Hello, Sturges. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm good. It's good to be here. Thanks.
Thanks so much for making time for me and my audience today.
Of course. My pleasure.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you today, Sturges. Obviously, ManifestSeven is in the space where you're solving for the complications when it comes to delivery and all these other kind of omni-channel ways of getting cannabis both to the B2C and B2B markets, right?
Yeah.
So before we start there and talk about ManifestSeven in more detail, let's first get a sense of who you are and what your background is. From my understanding, you have 18 years of experience across capital markets, investment banking, finance. So tell us about that and how you got into cannabis.
Yeah, sadly now it's closer to 20 than 18, I think. I'm dating myself. But I've been for the last 20 years, I guess what you would call a recovering investment banker. I started in technology investment banking in 2000, which was a really interesting place to start a career in that space. And funnily enough, over the course of my career, I've been through other bulge bracket banks. I ran a large family office in the United Kingdom for a while. Had a merchant bank based in Los Angeles shortly after that was focused on all alternative strategies. So one way or the other, my career is kind of focused on two things. One is emerging markets and alternative assets with a transactional focus on that. And then the other is navigating a bear market. I started at the implosion of the dot-com era and kind of, cut my teeth in banking in the aftermath of that and learned how to get a deal done in a difficult environment. It flash forward like 8 years later, and I was starting, on the asset management side with the family office, maybe about 3 weeks before Lehman filed bankruptcy. So I've learned how to transact in a headwind, and I've also been to this movie before. It's specifically applicable to cannabis. If you look at the trajectory, for example, of the way the technology market has developed over the last 20 years, it looks a lot like what is happening with cannabis and has been happening in the last 3 to 4. So for better or worse, I've come full circle right back to where I started at the forefront of a really exciting industry, but one that's fraught with a lot of challenges.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like you're in a better position now with cannabis at the forefront, right? And that industry about to really explode compared to your other experiences. Like you mentioned in technology when it was during the time of implosion, and then during the time of Lehman Brothers, kind of that whole financial crisis there, right? So you're in a better position now, I think. With it seems like there's more opportunity. Obviously, there's challenges, but it's got to be an exciting time.
Well, the challenges are what create the opportunity, right? So the inefficiency of this space, which is latent everywhere, the logistical challenges, the adoption challenges, the destigmatization, the regulatory complications, like all of that makes this one big giant Rubik's Cube. And to a large extent, that's, kind of anybody that's dealt with an emerging market and the lack of visibility, you are the canary in that coal mine. That's a skill set, for better or worse. Like I said, I started cutting my teeth on 20 years ago with technology. So, a lot of people look back and often say, well, if I knew then what I know now, I actually have that. and I think that's kind of an interesting angle from which to view this industry. And if you look at the evolution of those two spaces, I mean, you can literally take the NASDAQ from 1999 to 2001, actually through the present, and you can look at the cannabis index on the CSE, and if you overlay them, they look almost exactly alike. So it is really interesting, to kind of apply some of the lessons of the past to what's happening right now.
And there's no doubt, right, that with 20 years of experience and being in those major emerging industries that have now matured, and then kind of seeing it happen again, like that experience is invaluable, right? I would also think that cannabis is unique in that, like, the illicit market's been around for a while, right? And so these legacy operators kind of know the growing side, the cultivation side, the pricing and all that kind of stuff, because that's kind of been in place. But now you've got, professionals in various industries that are coming in, and they're adding value as well. So I'm saying the cannabis industry is unique in that, like, these two groups are coming together, whereas like with technology, it was kind of like everybody's figuring out together, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you have a structural difference for sure, fundamentally, right? One was the creation of a new market. This is really the cannibalization or the migration of a unregulated market into a regulated market. So there is something to cannibalize here, right? But the professionalization inflection point that we're at, that's where it gets interesting. And you're certainly right to point out the black market. I think really, if you ask any operator who keeps them up at night as a competitor, they're not going to name a company listed on the CSE. They're going to talk about the black market. That's still very much a prevalent and potent force in this space. But it's the professionalization of the regulated market that ultimately will put them out of business. Last I checked, most of the cartels didn't have an R&D budget, right? So product innovation, driving adoption, the safety that comes from regulation, the destigmatization that comes from just the pervasive acceptance of all of this, that's a cultural shift that's fundamentally necessary to widespread adoption in a way that just enforcement on its own will not be. So we're all in this together, one way or the other. And from a top-down perspective on the industry, kind of the trend towards more professionalized management and understanding of governance, risk management, attacking the fundamentals economically on the enterprise, all of those things have become priorities increasingly. And it's those management teams that will ultimately put the black market out of business, simply by providing a better product that's better innovated, that's safer, and eventually will be price competitive as well.
Yeah, no doubt. When you talk about, what I was referring to when I said the illicit market was more, within the country, right? Like, and specifically in states, in California or others that face that high taxation, that, heavy regulation when it comes to delivery and commerce. A lot of the things that you all are trying to solve, right? With your, I think I read on your website, the cannabis superhighway, right? So what I mean by illicit market is more internally as opposed to the cartels and whatnot, because, of course, the cartels have made a profit off of marijuana, right, over a number of years. But now that we've had more adult use states and whatnot, the quality of the product and the science behind what we're doing is far beyond, what the Mexican cartels are doing. And I would argue even that that's why they've kind of transitioned to fentanyl and maybe other drugs, because their profit margin with marijuana just isn't there anymore. But speaking
not the way it used to be, yeah.
Yeah. But speaking about specifically California, like, let's talk about the challenges when it comes to delivery. And like, because what I've heard from guests that I've talked to, like, certain municipalities may not allow for delivery of the product through that city or through that town, right? So how are y'all solving for this? And let's talk about the challenge and then talk about how y'all are solving.
Yeah, so I mean, I think from a regulatory perspective around the first issue you raised, it's an ever evolving environment. And at the end of the day, there's enough space in California that just becomes a logistical challenge. It's not one that really keeps us up at night. Obviously, an open kind of state, from north to south, east to west is always the preferential way to go. But it's nothing that's keeping us up at night. The challenges with delivery right now are actually still more fundamental around, just the quality of the service, the fact that it's a very fragmented market. There's lots of delivery services, particularly as you get into some of the primary markets. I think LA has something like 300 operating at the moment. But here's the thing, we come full circle back to what we were just talking about. Something like 2/3 of those are still illegal operators. So as the market contracts into a purely regulated market, you'll start to see, a couple of leaders really identified. You can pick out a few of who those are. I think we're one of them. But it's going to take a little bit of time for that to evolve. And, like any business that's based on response time to an order, it fundamentally comes down to logistics and footprint. Do you have enough delivery depots to shorten that response time, and stay consistent with kind of the standards as a retail experience that consumers have been accustomed to in other product categories, whether that's, pizza from Domino's or, an Uber ride, right? So it's all on demand. And so it's fundamentally just attacking the logistics of that. And that, again, I think comes down to footprint more than anything.
And I mean, let's dive deeper into that. So like, how complex is that, right? I mean, we see it at the state level where regulations differ. And then, I mean, it even gets more complex because you're talking about marijuana as opposed to maybe hemp, right? Which is now legal to grow in 2018, since 2018 Farm Bill. So talk to me like specifically about those challenges when it comes to logistically trying to map this out and build this cannabis superhighway,
Yeah, so the way that so first of all, it may be worth taking a step back and widening the aperture, right? So what we do is we put a very disciplined box around two verticals to the exclusion of everything else in the supply chain. So we focus on distribution, which is really a long haul exercise in moving scale product around the state. And then from there, what our delivery business does is it picks up the last mile from where that distribution business ends, which is typically at the retailer shelves, and goes all the way to the front door of the end user. So part of our approach to how to address the logistical challenges of delivery is in the other side of our business, which is distribution, and making sure that those two are seamlessly integrated to provide an end-to-end pathway and movement of the product, not from cultivator to retailer, but cultivator to the front door of the end user. So that's the first thing. The second is just with delivery in of itself, and this is my point about footprint. And, again, to date myself a little bit and go back to where we started in 1999 or 98, 2000, when you had the advent of, the cell phone market. That was a very fragmented market like it is now. It was very regional, right? So you had a lot of different providers. And if you were on the phone and you skipped the cell tower, your call would drop. It's the same thing with delivery. It's the same principle. Those delivery depots are a lot like cell phone towers in the late 90s. You need to have them spaced out in the right places across the state to make sure that you have seamless coverage of the state, no matter where a customer is calling from. So that's the objective we're trying to reach, is 100% coverage of the state in terms of response time within, say, 30 or 35 minutes. So it's very much like an antiquated cell phone model is the way that I look at it.
No, that's a great way to put it. That makes so much sense. So the two kind of points you raised were, being end to end in terms of like I guess you've acquired those cultivators and those manufacturers, right? And then at the end of the distribution, you're setting up different depots, like you said, so that it's super accessible to get to certain, areas of the state in a quick amount of time.
Correct. And so the sum total of that enterprise is in a place where there are assets on the ground moving product between all the stakeholders in the supply chain, from cultivators to the extractors to the manufacturers to the dispensaries. And then when it gets there, then it fans out. So we have the ability to take that product and put it directly into the hands of the end users that want it. And so that's a value proposition for my distribution clients, because I can say to them, hey, I can put you on the shelves of all the retailers just like everybody else, but I can also take you direct to consumer. I can put you in subscription boxes that are enabled by the delivery service. I can put you on the delivery menu with virtual shelf space, which is a whole other channel that no other distributor really controls. I can put you on a traditional e-commerce platform, because now with my delivery business, I can step into the shoes of the U.S. Postal Service or UPS, and I can get that order fulfilled directly to the end user. I have a captive consumer fulfillment program with delivery. So it's all about opening up new channels. It's all about normalizing the experience, whether that's on the enterprise side for the operator as a client of our distribution business or a customer of our retail landscape ordering from any of the channels that we're able to fulfill through.
Does that's fascinating. And does that model, like, by placing those different depots throughout the state of California, so that again you're able to deliver that end product to whatever the whoever the consumer is, B2B, B2C, right? Extraction lab, dispensary shelf, whatever. Does that help you surpass some of the regulatory compliance issues that you would face when it comes to delivery, like I mentioned earlier, within those municipalities?
No. Yeah, no. It helps us not circumvent them. It helps us operate on a compliant basis through them, right? So you can't really if you're really doing this the right way, and there are very few operators that truly are, then you're looking at it through the perspective of, how do I not get around the regulation? How do I conform to the regulation in a way that's economic? And with delivery, that's about essentially the pervasiveness of your footprint, and how much in the vicinity you really are, so to speak. So it's a slightly different view. The way I've used is kind of like hitting the slalom flags. You got to get from the top of the hill down to the bottom, but in order to do that the right way and actually score and medal, you got to hit every one of the flags on the way down. The regulations are very much like that. So it's just a function of being diligent and unimpeachable in making sure that you're hitting those flags in every transaction or every operation you're running.
Right. And that due diligence is an everyday exercise, right? Because the regulations are constantly changing and ever evolving. And so
it's a fluid environment. Yeah. You can put it that way.
Yeah. And I would imagine like y'all are having an eye on that, along with, the majority of cannabis operators in the space, with the new administration, with the momentum that we're seeing in the Senate, right? What is ManifestSeven's plan, say, if we start to open interstate commerce at some point?
So this is, really kind of at the core of the model we architected when we started 3.5 years ago. We decided we were not going to do pretty much what everybody has done, which is vertically integrate, which is do everything from cultivating to extracting to manufacturing to building our own brands to self-distributing to opening our own stores. The reason that model exists is because you have these temporarily artificial barriers between the states, right? So if you're going to expand from California to Nevada, you have to build an entire standalone infrastructure from top to bottom to do that. Well, to your point, if, in the next, whatever it is, 5 years, 1 year, those barriers lift, what infrastructure do you really need to run your enterprise and particularly scale it across the country? I'm not a believer that after the ban lifts, you're going to need, a 1 million square foot grow facility in Oklahoma. Our model was designed to basically counter program against that potential legacy redundant infrastructure. So everything that we do is complementary. We can replicate the model we've built in California in every state across the union. And when the barrier lifts, there's nothing that's redundant. Every single one of those delivery depots, every single one of those distribution centers connect together. And the connective tissue in that case is finally the legal use of the federal highway system. So we've architected, a business model that anticipates that happening. It put more pressure on us now during the period that we're so overregulated, but once that burden lifts, so does all the friction, and the enterprise is just going to gear, and overnight it would become, basically a true domestic business. So, we've disciplined ourselves, as tempting as it has been in certain cases, not to enter any of the businesses upstream. We do distribution and we do retail. We do it in a highly integrated and differentiated way, and that is all we do. And that is a universally needed value proposition across the space, and it's also one that will populate from state to state in a highly efficient and integrative way as well once the state ban lifts.
It's interesting. I mean, it's a really a forward-looking approach, right? And it's almost like you said. I mean, let's take our licks now. I mean, y'all are doing well in terms of the environment that you're operating in California, but you see, what's to come, and you're kind of anticipating for that change.
Yeah, it's like, marathon training at altitude. If you can get an enterprise profitable today, believe me, it's going to be wildly profitable in a few years when the regulations normalize. So that is the objective, right? But at the end of the day, you do have to be forward thinking. This whole space, because there's no precedent for it, to give a nod to my friends up north, it's all about skating to that puck, right? And what is that puck? It is ultimately the lifting of this ban and the positioning now to make, to fully exploit that moment when it happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. So talk to me, about what y'all are focused on for this year and next. Like I think I read one of your press releases saying you launched a new local on-demand cannabis delivery operation. So talk to me a little bit about that announcement, but also like, really what your future plans are.
Yeah, so over the last couple of weeks, we made a few announcements that all relate generally to our Northern California operations. We expanded our first distribution center, which was based in Oakland, to a new location in Brisbane, which is a much larger facility. It's also a much lower tax rate municipality, so there's an enormous amount of tax savings in that migration. So that's given us a new state-of-the-art facility for distribution business in Brisbane to service basically the greater San Francisco Bay Area. As part of that, we also won a license for local on-demand deliveries. So we're delivering out of Brisbane to service a specific swath of space where there's literally no retail licensed at all. So we are one of the only delivery companies servicing essentially from San Francisco to San Jose, a totally retail devoid area. By doing all of that, when we moved the distribution business out of our old facility in Oakland, that gave us the ability to rededicate that space in Oakland to purely delivery. So we now have a dedicated market in Oakland that's 1,000 times bigger in terms of the serviceable space than it was before. So basically, all of that is organic growth in Northern California, just to build out our infrastructure in the north. We have a matching infrastructure already in the south. So our focus now is just infilling the additional markets around those two core poles. So a couple of delivery operations probably in the center of the state, most likely along the coast and in the Central Valley, a couple of primary markets for dispensaries, to help kind of that tentpole revenue generative mini DC model. All of that is a focus of the next year. For the next 12 months, we are heads down on completing California. We're most of the way there. This is the largest market in the world. It is the epicenter of a global phenomenon in cannabis. So finishing, driving the flag into the ground into the state is still our focus and will be through the end of the year. By then, we'll have rounded out the infrastructure and the services set enough that we'll be able to start migrating and rolling out the model into other states. That'll be next year.
What is y'all's footprint in California? Like, how much market share do y'all have when it comes to delivery?
So if you took our delivery operations alone, they theoretically cover about 88% of the state's population, qualifying population. So it's a pretty healthy footprint.
Yeah.
Our coverage is there. We've got the breadth. Now, as we were saying, it's about the depth. So it's quite conceivable that we would have maybe more than one delivery operation in San Francisco. It's a really dense market, one that may require like an east-west approach or a north-south approach. So we're still going to proliferate those operations in the place where it tactically makes sense. But for the most part, we've achieved a coverage in the state, that's pretty pervasive. It's more people than live in Canada at this point right now.
Yeah, and Sturges, I'm curious because that is significant, 88% on the delivery side, right? But it's almost like there's even a bigger opportunity because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard that only like 30% or 30 and change percent of municipalities in California allow for marijuana or cannabis to be sold in that city, right? So it's
that's right.
So, I mean, and how often are more of these cities and towns voting on allowing it? Like, is that a trend? Is that happening or not?
Yeah, it's happening. I mean, you can see it almost microcosmically, right? So coming out of COVID, I don't think it was a coincidence that 5 states went legal. There's an economic imperative for this. There's a social imperative for it. The adoption is increasing. As destigmatization comes down, the friction politically on, making the case for the economic and the social points becomes a lot, easier and more defensible. So I think you circumstantially have, from the state level, you have economic pressure that's really driving a lot of those decisions. That's circumstantial or contextual out of the year that we just came from. As you go further down, kind of, into the micro level, on the local level, California, has 480 cities and another 70 counties. And to your point, a minority of those have adopted legislation. This state is not even fully realized, right? And it's the largest market in the world. So that trend will continue. There's as much of the same economic imperative on the cities as there were on the states, last fall, to capture an opportunity to generate a new tax base. And so you're seeing the same thing here. It's just a matter of time and just a matter of kind of the organic process of allowing the municipalities to get there.
Right. No, that makes sense. Wow. It's so fascinating. There's so many different, just trends and issues and things going on, that it's fascinating. And it's just a plant, it's insane. Tell me what you
three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're playing 4D chess or something, tell me what you envision coming first when it comes to federal reform, right? We know that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Cory Booker, they're working on some type of legislation. Is it going to be safe banking first? Is it going to be removal of 280E? How does that all play out?
That's a good question. I think that, my sense is it's going to be incremental. So we're not going to get federal legalization overnight. And there's a whole host of issues to unpack there too. Everybody talks about federal legalization like the federal government has a magic wand and, just adopting the legislation is ultimately it. Once you get the federal government involved in this, it's going to take a while to implement, right? You have multiple agencies that have a stake in that pie, whether that's, ATF or the FDA. There's going to be a lot more involved in actually making this legal rather than just voting on it becoming legal. So that's number one. Number two, I think if you look at the legislative history, the likelihood is we're going to see, banking reform first. And frankly, I think that's probably one of the key ones. And in a lot of ways, if you ask operators that are thinking ahead, many of them will tell you that we're not, and myself included, we're not in a race to get to full legalization yet. We like those barriers. They keep the big balance sheets out and allow kind of the entrepreneurial businesses to build first into something that those guys are eventually going to want to buy, whether that's big tobacco, big alcohol, big logistics, et cetera. So the incrementalization approach is actually the preferred one. I would love an environment where those balance sheets, the bigger guys, are still held at bay, but I have the ability to operate like a normal enterprise, and I can bank my money and I can file my taxes like everybody else. That's an ideal operating environment, right? Because I'm protected, but I'm normalized. So I think that's where we're headed first. I think we'll see banking reform. 280E might be a little bit tricky because I think you actually have to remove kind of a lot of the implications of the Controlled Substances Act to get there. But if we hit banking, just that alone in the next year, it is an entirely different ballgame for every operator in this country if that happens.
Yeah, I totally agree too. We want that time, we want that period where these small to medium sized operators have a chance for growth, right? And these MSOs, because we know eventually, the most likely outcome is going to be big pharma, big tobacco coming in, right? And buying up. But there's got to be that growth period. And, one way to get there is by listing on the NASDAQ, right? You mentioned that y'all are listed on this CSC, and which most MSOs are, right? And so, is that part of safe banking or is that separate? And I'm asking just because I don't know.
I think it's separate, but it's related, right? So right now, a lot of this stuff is not illegal per se. A lot of it is just risk management. If I'm a bank, I'm not going to risk my federal charter, even if technically I can do this. So a lot of it is just I think these organizations, these institutions, just getting the green light or the thumbs up that they're not going to be prosecuted for engaging in this commerce.
Right.
So, you know, and going back to your point about, you know, the balance sheets or, you know, big pharma, big tobacco, big logistics, whatever, you know, that runway is so critical. I mean, that's what every other, you know, kind of industry has been able to do is a germination period where, you know, the businesses that the bigger guys are either going to want or have to buy have some time to thrive and flourish a little bit and become that. And so, you know, all of this kind of adds up to the same lesson, which is, you know, we want to push certain things, but not others.
Right.
And as far as the NASDAQ point, as far as that goes, I think, you know, the exchanges, they're going to follow the banking trend, but I think they're going to lag behind it because you ultimately need, you know, if an issuer can't bank their cash, they're not getting on the exchange. So there is, you know, some incrementalization there as well, I believe.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's just kind of a natural next step, right? Because like you said,
yeah,
their federal charter is not at risk at that point because safe banking is passed, right? So, well, hey Sturgis, I really enjoyed the conversation, man. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
No, just off the back of you know what we were just talking about. It's funny because for the last couple of years, particularly going to Canada, as we've seen these multiples in these insane places from time to time, I've often gotten the question, so who do you want to buy you? And, you know, everybody has an idea, whether it's Canopy or it's Cresco, and my answer has always been, you know, Amazon is going to buy us. That's what we're building here. That's the trajectory we're on. That's the time horizon we're on. Those are the dimensions of our ambitions. We're going to build an institutional enterprise that Jeff is going to have to buy at the end of the day, whether he knows it or not now. So that's where we're headed, and that's what we're focused on.
That's awesome. Well, I think he's the new CEO now. I think, didn't Jeff step down, or is he
It'll
still...
always be Jeff.
Long live Jeff. That's right. Hey, well, speaking of, where can people find your ticker information, social media, websites, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so our ticker is MSVN on the Canadian Securities Exchange, the CSE. That's M as in mother, S as in Sam, V as in Victor, N as in Nancy. And you can find everything about us on ManifestSeven.com. That's manifest, the numeral 7.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Sturgis, and I look forward to having you back on as the company grows and progresses and the industry evolves.
No, thanks so much for having me. It's been great to chat. Really enjoyed it.
Awesome. And thank you all for listening, guys. Bye.